About a year ago, 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, were killed in a mass shooting in the Atlanta area in Georgia. This was one of the many hate crimes directed towards Asian Americans that year. The suspect was a white man. He claimed he had a sexual addiction in order to explain his attack. The spas that these women worked in were tempting, and he did what he did to take out that temptation. Now, this isn't the first time that Asian women, specifically East Asian and Southeast Asian women, were seen as nothing but temptation. This narrative goes back as far back as the early 19th century in the United States, according to Judy Wu, director of the Humanities Center and professor of Asian American Studies at UC Irving. So today we'll look at where this Asian fetish comes from and why it's so problematic. You might be surprised if I told you that the US government played a significant role in developing this stereotype, and that seems like a common theme for racial stereotypes. So anyways, in our US history courses in high school, we've all learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but less people know about the 1875 Page Act. The white population began to fear that the immigration of 300,000 Chinese immigrants would cost them their jobs. The Page Act targeted workers from, I quote, China, Japan, or any Oriental country. And the damage went further when it halted the immigration of Chinese women into the United States. The bill states it blocked, and I quote, the transportation into the United States of women for the purposes of prostitution. So basically, Asian women were profiled as prostitutes. In legislature, there was also an infamous and controversial lawsuit in which 22 Asian American women, were specifically Chinese women, were accused of being lewd in the San Francisco Bay Harbor, and without sufficient evidence, and they were apprehended. So see the description for more. But the Page Act didn't just exclude women for kicks and giggles. It was a deliberate and genius diabolical effort to limit the growth of the Chinese population in the United States, prevent Chinese men from starting families, and you're basically restricting Asian immigration. So the government, with its authority and its basically supreme decision making, decided that if Chinese women were to come to the United States, they would engage in prostitution. The stereotype got worse when the United States got involved in the Asia-Pacific region. So military culture was for soldiers to drink, gamble, party, and visit brothels in the countries that they were stationed in. And the women in these countries, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, had to pay the price. Think about it this way. If there is a war going on in your country and there are foreign influences involved, then the average person probably isn't doing too well economically. So the military shows up and does whatever it wants. And the local women living through these difficult times had little job opportunities, and they ended up working for these brothels. Not because they wanted to or they enjoyed it, or because being born Asian inherently makes you promiscuous and enjoy working in a brothel. So Korea was actually a Japanese colony at some point, and Japan had military brothels with about 200,000 enslaved Korean women, providing service to Japanese military officials, or guys, or men. Japanese troops. That's the word I was looking for. So the US military began to take over these Japanese brothels and use them basically for their own entertainment. They were near military bases and they were called camp towns. Eventually there was a crackdown on sexually transmitted diseases and people were getting tested. And in 1965, 85% of troops said that they had slept with or been with a prostitute. Basically, it became the way for soldiers to blow off their steam from the war, and in these sites it was the Asian women providing this gratification. The orphan or poor woman had little options for making money. Kara Jobula Karalis, the executive director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, says this, and I'm paraphrasing here: men, specifically white men, they've been conditioned, they've been trained or peer pressured and hazed by the US military into letting out their negative emotions like anxiety, self-loathing, and hatred of the enemy onto Asian women's bodies. So they just let everything out, and the go-to place was Asian women. The stereotype of the petite, submissive, and sexually available Asian woman was brought home by the soldier to the States. But they weren't the only ones developing the stereotype, because there were also operas and films like Madame Butterfly and Full Metal Jacket that portrayed these stereotypes. Specifically, the Lotus Flower or China doll stereotype, in which Asian women were submissive, sexually subservient, very feminine and shy. There's another stereotype known as the Dragon Lady. It sounds so ridiculous, sounds like a type of sushi you can get, in which Asian women were seen as deceptive, evil, and clever, using sexuality for manipulation and power. power. And this was historically associated with the actress Anna May Wong, who was usually almost always casted as a wicked villainess or an exotic slave girl. Asians make up only about 4.8% of all film roles, but they seem to be overrepresented in pornography. A 2002 study found that Asian women were overrepresented in violent pornography in which they were the victim. And then there's also the mail order bride business that really boomed in the 80s and the 90s, advertising to Western men, telling them that they should look overseas, try to find a woman who would have traditional values. So newspapers and magazines would entice readers with phrases like gorgeous Pacific women or pearls of the Orient, and having women pose and wear erotic cultural dresses. And a lot of these mail order brides ended up facing domestic violence once they arrived, traveling across like half the world to get here. But the idea still exists. You have Instagram meme pages of Asian women showing the kind of creepy and disgusting texts that they get from random guys. I won't even repeat what they say. But if you're an Asian woman, you definitely know what I'm talking about, right? And now we have the waifu wars, the obsession with the ara ara, with like Japanese phrases. I guess the idolization of Japanese and Korean culture is South Korean culture is a topic for another time. But if you still don't understand why it's problematic, let me spell it out for you. This isn't about preference. This is about people assuming that another group of people have an inherent quality, and to assume that they're nothing more than just an object for your pleasure. It's not okay for you to see East Asian women, or any woman or person for that matter, as a sexual object. People have feelings, believe it or not, and they don't exist so that you can use them. Some people just aren't taught that. And sometimes these biases just sneak in without us realizing it. So watch your biases. Stay frosty. Until next time.